Welcome to another tutorial on Rhino Grasshopper. My name is Carl Dobman. I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design at LTU. And for this tutorial, I wanted to just quickly show how to use the Grasshopper Player, which is a new function in Rhino7, and show how to configure that in relationship to Grasshopper and how to set that up. So first I want to show you how this works. And so maybe we'll even just maximize Rhino for a second. And what it allows you to do is if you go under Grasshopper but hold down the button, there's a thing called Grasshopper Player. You can also type this out. Once you initiate that, it's going to ask you for a file. This is going to be linked to your Grasshopper file. And this is the Grasshopper file that I've got open. You can close it. But really what this is if you are working with someone that doesn't use Grasshopper, but they're using Rhino. So again, that's a subset of people. But you've developed a Grasshopper definition, and you want to share it with someone, and then they can initiate this just within Rhino. And so you'll ask them to launch the player, the Grasshopper Player, find your file, and click OK. What will then happen is that they'll be prompted based on inputs that you've defined for, they'll be prompted based on the status bar. So if we just do this quickly, we can see I'm looking for a seed value between 0 and 500. And you can see you can also set a default that can be useful at points. So if I don't change anything, if I just hit enter, it'll default to 58. But why don't I do 147? Enter. Now it's asking me for the radius, and this is something that I've decided that I want 3 values between 2 and 6. And what you're seeing on the screen now is that it's the first instance that we've created in Grasshopper, and then as I change the values, it's producing a new version over the top of it. And this can be a little confusing, and whether or not I actually don't love this about it, because what I would like is to be able to hide my original Grasshopper instance, and then as I provide values that something's created, but it'll only do that at the end. And so we can see some of those differences. So now I'll enter 3 values, which are my base radius for these cones. 5, enter, 6, enter, 3, enter. And now it's asking me for the heights, 3 values between 5 and 20. So why did I do 8, 9, and 10? So what it did now is it produced geometry that's here. I'll move this to the side. So it produced 3 unioned cones. And this is baked geometry. We could initiate this again, which we would just go back to the player, find our file, and then do the same thing. We could do a different seed value. 3 more values here. And 3 values. And this produces another baked set of 3 unioned cones based on the inputs that we gave it. So I'm just doing this as a very simple example to share the workflow related to the Grasshopper Player and how we set this up. So let's take a look at the definition. And here we have Grasshopper. And so I've set this up in a way, and maybe even what I'll do is I'll just hide everything that's here. And we'll start a new definition. And so the way that I constructed this, if we just go through this and look at it simply, is that first thing that I'm doing is creating some random numbers. I want 6 random numbers because what I want are X and Y components for 3 points. And that's really what I'm doing here. So I've got a random number, 6 of them, and they're between 2 and 8. And I've actually moved this whole thing over so that it doesn't conflict. So we'll see it here. What I'm doing then is splitting my list and giving half of those random values and the other half of the random values to 2 separate lists, so I can feed that to X and Y components here. And actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of my move. So this gets a little simpler. And the other thing that we see here off to the side is I'm just pulling that range, and that range here I'm setting from 2 to 8. If you haven't followed these before, it's really simple to make a domain just by using a simple panel and say 2 to 8. And so then what I'm doing is splitting that domain. I'm taking the small number, feeding that to X and Y coordinates, and then I'm making a rectangle. So the rectangle gives me a kind of boundary that my random numbers sit within. And so if we change the seed value, we can see the way that these 3 values or 6 values tied to the X and Y bounce around within there. Once I have that, I've got 2 other inputs, the radius for the cones and the height for the cones. So if I turn on the cones, we can see them. If we change the seed value, we'll see the cones move around. All that's changing as I change the random number is their location. It's still the 3 same cones because those values are tied to these panels. Once I have those, I'm just unioning them together and then joining them at the end. So we can hide both of these, and then we see what we end up with here. And so it looks like there's only 2 cones because of their placement. That's a cone sitting inside of the other cone as well. So here we have our 3 cones that are unioned together. So let's look at how we set this up now. Now you understand the basic function of the way that the Grasshopper definition is working. Let's now add our inputs for the Grasshopper Player. And we find these under parameters and under utilities. And there's these sets of components here that are basically tied to the get command. We can get an integer, we can get a number, point, line, string, and then there's a context print and a context bake. So first, let's start with get a number. Actually, in this case, let's do get an integer. And we can place this here. And this integer is what we want to get related to our seed value. And we can see that these get components have both an input and an output, but they're shaped differently than some of our other components that we're used to. In this case, what I'd like to do, and this is the instance where we can see with when we did this previously, there's a default. And maybe even I'll just do this incrementally and show you how it works. So first, let's plug in our get integer to get a seed value. If we right click on the component, we can see we can change its name, but there's a prompt. When we click this, this will open a menu, and this is what we want it to say. So get a seed value, and here I can even say between 0 and 500, although what I type here maybe doesn't matter. Even though my slider is from 0 to 500, this could be a different type of seed value, but I'm going to say OK. This does allow us to set how many values we get. We want at least 1 value. At most is left blank, but in this case, I want to set it to 1 and enter. And we can also set a min and a max. So here, I'll set the minimum for this to be 0, and I can set the max to be 500. So if we save our file now, our Grasshopper file, fine. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of hiding the top part, I'm going to delete the top part because this still has some of those get functions within here. Now I just want to have it very clear and not see anything else. I'm going to save my Grasshopper definition, and then I'm going to come to Rhino and launch the player. I'm going to find the file that I'm working on in Grasshopper and open it. And now we can see get a seed value between 0 and 500. I'll say 200, enter, and it says no output contextual components in definition. That's okay, because we haven't finished this yet. So let's continue to work through this. One thing that we want is we want something to happen at the end. And this is, you saw when I did this originally, it baked it. And so we're going to put a context bake at the end. And we'll add that. And it didn't collect any data because it still needs the inputs. And that's okay. We can see this is looking for these inputs. Let me do 2 more inputs here using the get function, and maybe this time I'll do get number, because this could be an input that's not an integer. It could be a real. And I'm going to add this to the radius. And so let's start with our prompt. I don't know why this is defaulting over to the side. So this will be 3 values for the radius. And I could say, what do I have? Between 2 and 6. But those can vary as well. And then I'm going to copy this and put this in for the length as well, the length of the cone. So my prompt will be, and you can see as I copied it, it copies those values, 3 values for the height, and between, let's say 5 and 20. We have those. Now let's see if this works without any of the defaults. I'm going to save this, and then let's play it again. So, interesting. I thought it should ask for the seed value. So let's see. Let's look at how this is defining it. 3 values for the radius between 2 and 6. Say 4, 5, 6. 3. Let's hit enter. And this is, I didn't set the maximum number of values. And so if you want an unlimited number of values, I'll show you how to change that. For now, we'll just hit enter. Now it asks for the seed value. And now it asks for the height. And we can see the way that that built it along the way. And now I can just hit enter, and it automatically bakes that. So let's look at some of the specifics here. So with our get number, and let's see, just change a couple of things. For the get number, we did not change the at least we want 1, at most we actually want 3. So when we set this value, we don't have to hit enter to move on to the next prompt. And so I'll set at most 3. And let's save this, and we'll run it again, and we'll see how that's changed, just so you can see the change in the functionality as we do this. Set a seed value between 0 and 500. 3 values for the radius. And now watch what happens once I enter the third one. So 3, 4, 5. It will automatically go to the next one because I supplied 3 values, and I told it I wanted the maximum of 3 values. And now 3 values for height. And then it automatically bakes that at the end. So let me do one more thing. Let's see. And I'm testing something as I go here. We can set a min and a max. And so let's see what this tells us. So this one, we're saying a min is 2 and our max is 6. And let's change that. And we'll save this and we'll see if that makes a difference. I'm not sure it makes a difference in the prompt, but and maybe I'll enter a value outside of that. So set 3 values for the radius between 2 and 6. 2, 6, and now I'll do 9. And now this is where it prompts us that the number must be smaller than or equal to 6. And so this is nice if we want to be specific about these types of values. We can set that with the min and the max. So I'll set this one to 2, 3 values for the height, 5, 6, 7, and then a seed value. And so that's constructed 3 more. And now let's just look at, let's see. What we can also do, here's the input on these get values. And so if, and I believe this only works with 1 value, but if you only have 1 value for what you're, like in this case, we're looking for 1 seed value, we can set a default condition, and the input for this is the default that's already there. And so now you can see that it begins to produce some geometry that's here. So let me save this again. And we'll launch the player. And I just happen to be calling my file player, so don't be confused by that. So 3 values for the radius between 2 and 6. 3, 4, 5. Get a seed value. And then set the values for the height between 5 and 20. And so remember, between the parentheses here between 5 and 20 is what I wrote in the prompt. But when we also set the min and the max, this will come back and tell you you're outside of those range of values. So let's say 5, 6, 7. And now we have another version of that. So the other thing that I've been playing with, and I forgot to highlight where we saw the default, is just as I've been doing this, I've been changing and I was speculating for a second, the height within the files. Let me even change these numbers. The way that we're prompted through the player, I believe, has to do with the location of these, and it's actually in their height in the file, which is a kind of interesting thing. So let's watch 2 things. We'll watch for the default. Here, let's change this to 380. This will be our default when we prompt this. So let me save. And let's run the Grasshopper Player again. So now you can see I changed the order of these, but get a seed value between 0 and 500. We can see that the default, if we were just to hit enter now, the default will be tied to the slider that we have set there. And so let's just hit enter, and now 3 heights. And so you can see I've changed the order of these from top to bottom within the file, and it's changing the order that they come up here. And so now the heights, let's say 16, 17, 18, and then the values between 2 and 6, let's say 3, 4, 5. So we end up with another baked geometry here. In the end, what I want is the specific order of these will be first the seed value, then the radius, then the height. And the other thing is that with 3 values here driven from the panel, there's not a default value for these. But you can see as we add them, so if I disconnect these for a second, we can see we're getting an error just in that it's not producing geometry until it receives a value. So if we run it through the player, it's constructing these as we go. If I add these values, right, when we can see these currently with an error, if I give them default values, and in this case they're multiple default values, now we see the initial default geometry that's there. And so let's run this once more. Really, I'm just working through these couple of options to give you the information depending on how you want this to work. So if I initiate this, we'll get a seed value. The default is fine. 3 values for the radius, 3, 4, 5. And you can see with multiple values coming in here driven by the panel, we're not seeing default values for these. And it's really only the default value is 1, or the default, there's only, in terms of the quantity, there's only one default value when we give it a slider. If we're driving it from a panel with multiple values, that doesn't work. So 3 values for the height between 5 and 12, 16, 17, 18. So then we can see, I've already done that one before, but that results. The way that we could solve this, if you really wanted to have one default condition, is we could separate this out. So rather than asking for 3 values with this one get number, we could have 3 separate get numbers related to this. The other thing is I did make the distinction between get an integer and get a number. So let's do that. And the other thing I want to do is that we can hide our geometry there. And so if we want to see this kind of being created, we can hide our grasshopper geometry so that we don't have those overlapping. So let's save this one last time and run it once more. And so get a seed value, 3 values for the radius. And so because this is a number, I can say 2.5, I can say 3.75, and I can say 5.565, and give it a whole bunch of decimals, which it didn't like. So let's see how many values. Oh no, that was for the height. Oh, that's going to be very tall. Let's see, I think if we do Control Z, it does allow us to go back 1. So let's say 6.35, 7.25, 9.77. And now that constructed those. So that's also the subtle difference between an integer and a number, which allows you to get more specific with the decimal places. And you also just saw if you use Control Z while you're in that, in the prompt, it will go back to the previous prompt. So really nice. And again, a couple of nice new tools in Rhino7 and a very specific application. Again, if you're sharing information, if you're sharing a Grasshopper definition with someone that doesn't use Grasshopper. So maybe within your office context, you're developing a tool that you want someone else to be able to use. They're familiar with Rhino, not with Grasshopper. This is a perfect application for that. So if this was helpful, give it a like, consider subscribing, and let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to see what you come up with this and what you do with this.